In this episode, Jim Pelletier, Senior Product Manager at Wolters Kluwer TeamMate, discusses the data dilemma, exploring how internal auditors can ensure data integrity amid advancing technologies and regulations.
Jim Pelletier, thanks so much for joining me today on this special edition of All Things Internal Audit podcast.
Hey, Robert, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So before we dive in, I did want to share with our listeners a little information about you and your extensive internal audit experience. In addition to serving in a number of leadership roles here at the IIA for about a decade, Jim previously worked as city auditor for the city of Palo Alto, California, and was chief of audits for the county of San Diego in California. His diverse internal audit background also includes positions at California State University System, Petco Animal Supplies, State Street Corporation, and General Electric. Jim, who also holds the CIA and CGAP certifications from the IIA, is currently Senior Product Manager with TeamMate Audit Solutions, where he works to continuously improve audit productivity while developing strategic insights via TeamMate's best-in-class solutions. So that's pretty impressive credentials, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. It's been a great journey so far. I've been lucky to be involved with the internal audit profession for as long as I have.
Excellent. So the topic for today is data, and particularly data quality and all that entails in the current business environment. Let's start by discussing briefly the importance of understanding data quality.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. When we're talking about data quality, we're really talking about accuracy, completeness, reliability, and relevance of the data, right? So however we're collecting, storing, and using data across the organization, we need to consider at least those four factors, right? Accuracy, completeness, reliability, and relevance. Those are key, right? Because, why? This data is needed for good decision-making. It supports regulatory compliance and external reporting. It helps with operational efficiency in the organization. And ultimately, and I think really importantly, it impacts stakeholder trust and confidence, right? So it's important for the organization, which means it really needs to be important for the audit department, right? So for all those reasons, it's really foundational for internal audit to be able to perform its role, right? The way we perform our role effectively is to be able to rely on good, high quality data. My perspective, it's an area that internal audit really should focus a lot of energy to make sure that they have good data when they're doing their work.
Yeah. And the key in your statement there is that they need to have reliable quality data, and that requires effective controls to ensure that the right data is being captured. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, our controls are important, but I'd even go back a step before that, and I'd say people, process, and technology, right? What's the people, process, and technology behind those controls? Are the right people involved? Do the processes work the way they're expected? Are they consistent in what is done and the data they produce at the end? And then importantly, are the technologies that have been implemented, are they working in a way that they're properly capturing, storing, and using the data, right? So we have to think about all of those things. And all of those things really have to come together for high quality data to be produced. So I think internal auditors, they have to, when they're doing their work, they have to consider all of that, right? And I think that's going to be a part of how auditors think through this is, where does that data come from? What are the sources of that data? Who are the people involved? What are the processes? How those processes work? Do those processes have good controls in place? What systems are they using? How do those systems capture that data? How do they interconnect? How do I get good output from that, right? Because from my experience as an internal auditor, one of the challenges I've had year after year and time after time and audit after audit is getting good data in order to move forward, right? Just getting to the data sometimes is a challenge. And then the quality of the data is sort of the next big step on that, right?
And what you're describing really is a pretty complex data governance process. Where do most organizations fit in as far as having an ideal data governance setup?
Yeah, I think this is a good question because I think there's a ton of variation here across organizations. But generally, I see that many organizations, even large companies, are in the mid to low side of the maturity scale when it comes to data governance. And I think there's two key factors for me that drive this, and they're really interrelated. But I think most organizations have pretty discrete silos, both in terms of how they operate, but also as well as the technology that they use, right? So on that technology side, this means that many organizations have multiple, somewhat overlapping systems, right, that are not consistent in how they were implemented, as they were probably adopted over time, and they were, they were adopted to probably serve a specific purpose, at that time, right? And then we start to realize that there may be some overlapping aspects of one technology that maybe another department could have used or something along those lines, right? But has ended up happening at a lot of organizations is organizations bought point solutions at a point in time, and those point solutions don't necessarily talk to each other. They don't share data well. They may have been implemented at varying levels of quality in terms of how the implementation was actually actually carried out. So I think you see a lot of organizations, like I said, even large, which you would typically consider more mature organizations, they still struggle with those silos, right? They struggle with the silos that we're used to hearing about every day in terms from a people or cultural perspective, but they also struggle with, what I would call their technology silos.
So from an internal audit perspective, where should internal audit be focusing its efforts to ensure that organizations have that right data or that right data governance?
Yeah, it really goes back to people, process, and technology. I'll go there again, right? And I would say, particularly the process and technology components. We know from an internal audit perspective, we're certainly not going to control the people aspect that much, but we can really dive into the process and technology components. So when it comes to data, I think there's kind of two steps that internal auditors can start with. First, I think data quality should be considered a part of the evaluation criteria and risk assessment, right? So when I'm looking at an entity in my organization, do I have an understanding of the quality of data that entity is using and producing, right? So where do they get their data from? Is that data quality that's coming into their processes, right, that their technology is using? And then are they producing good quality data out of the processes and technology that they're applying to the data that they're getting, right? So you have to understand those different components of it. I think that's a big piece. I think the second is that then internal audit needs to make sure they're taking the time to validate the quality of the data that it is using as part of an audit, right? So we consider it as part of a risk assessment to say, as a factor of, do we need to spend more time on this business entity? Among many factors, it's not the only one, but it should be, I think, among the factors that auditors need to consider. Second is, now when I'm executing an audit, am I taking the time, right, to evaluate the quality of the data that I'm receiving? I mean, and that sounds pretty basic and obvious, but how often have auditors kind of just taken that spreadsheet that they've been given, or that was emailed to them, and then just kind of gone to the next step, right? Have we actually thought about, I'm going to pause here and I'm going to ask, how do I know that this data is completely accurate and reliable? Right. I think we do that routinely when we're doing more, data analytics and kind of getting into deeper analysis. But are we thinking about that even when we're doing some more simple testing? Right. So I think that's a place that we want to make sure we're spending enough effort, based off of the risk associated with that data. Right. We're not going to spend a lot of time on something that's low risk, but in moderate to higher risk areas, when that data is a key component of that, are we spending a sufficient amount of time making sure we really understand where that data is coming from?
So I wanted to take a little bit more of a 10,000-foot view on this from an internal leader, audit leader perspective.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to data governance and data strategy for the whole organization, how does an audit leader get that seat at the table and sort of get involved at the front end?
Yeah, 3 words: relationships, knowledge, and strategy. Right? Do you have good working relationships with the right people in the organization? Do you know enough about the topic to have meaningful conversations? Right? There's nothing worse than sitting down with a technology person and them immediately realizing that you don't have a clue what you're talking about. Right? It undermines your credibility as an audit leader from the start. Right? So making sure that before you engage in these conversations, that you have sufficient understanding of the topic at hand, whatever topic it happens to be, that you can have meaningful conversations with the experts, right? You don't have to know more than them, but you have to know enough that you can have a good conversation, right? So I think that's a piece. And then, do you have a strategy for how your department can add value when it comes to data quality? Like, what are you going to do with it, right? If you're going to jump into the space, how are you going to impact the organization in a positive manner? And then how do you have a plan for how you're going to communicate that strategy effectively? Right. So a lot of times we think about things we want to do, or that, hey, we got to get into this space. But how do we talk to people about it? How do we talk to people about why internal audit has a role to play within the organization in this space? Right. Because a lot of people say, hey, data quality, that's not your space. That's my space. I own that as first line. Right. Or I'm responsible for it from an ERM perspective, whatever it happens to be. All right, what's our perspective from internal audit? How do we tell that story as to why we feel that this is something important, that it's significant enough for us to spend our time here?
I can't stress enough that data is at the heart of all the new technologies that are coming in. I mean, obviously, artificial intelligence is the elephant in the room that's promising to rewrite how business is done.
Right.
All this can be sort of overwhelming if you haven't had much experience addressing data and data quality. So how can internal auditors get started?
Yeah, I mean, let me start with this, because you mentioned artificial intelligence, right? So the risks associated with data quality can become exponentially worse when you factor in things like AI, right? So, so it's really hot right now to talk about generative AI. So let me go there for a second, right? So we've all heard that generative AI, it can hallucinate or it can have bias. So one of the ways that you can help the AI to be more accurate is to expose your organization's data to it through something that's one example would be through it's what's called retrieval augmented generation. And essentially what that means is it lets the AI look at your data for answers, and then it uses its underlying language model to provide you a conversational response, right? But you have more confidence in the answer because it's referring to more authoritative data. It's not just scanning its entire knowledge from the internet. It's being pointed at this more authoritative data that you've provided it, right? But imagine if that data is not quality, right? So now you have an exponentially worse problem, because anybody who queries that data thinking that it's more authoritative is actually being potentially misled by that data, right? So technologies like this can have a multiplying effect on the risks associated with data quality. And I'll just say this, like, technology, it's a tool, right? And any tool can be used for good or evil. So internal audit's job is to make sure that tool is being used for good, right? And so I think that needs to be considered. AI is a tool, and that tool can do good, it can do bad things depending on how it's used. So we need to get in there and make sure that it's being used in the right way, and that the data that it's leveraging is good quality data, because otherwise you're not going to get a good quality response.
Yeah, I mean, and as I mentioned earlier, it can be overwhelming, or it's, at least if you're just getting into it, can seem overwhelming. And when you hear stories, potential horror stories about how it can be used negatively, it can be even more daunting. So give me maybe a top 3 things that you can do as an audit leader to ensure that your organization is getting data quality and that your audit shop is actually comfortable in using that quality.
Yeah, great question. So here, 3 things, right? So and not necessarily in any specific order. So just, first thing, I would promote data literacy and training to my team and to the broader organization, right? We can't evaluate what we don't understand. And so I think that's key. And in those conversations we were talking about earlier, you can't have a good conversation if you don't understand. And frankly, one team member on your internal audit team can undermine the credibility of your entire department by going out there and having embarrassing conversations about a topic they don't understand, right? So bringing your team up to speed on this and any other hot topic is key. Second, I would look to integrate data quality into my risk assessment process, as I mentioned earlier, right? Use that as an opportunity to collaborate and have conversations with the IT department and the business units to gain that in-depth understanding of how and where data is collected, stored, and used across your organization. Where are the silos? Where are things breaking down? Where are we not able to share data effectively, or where are we not able to get to the data we need? Where does the organization not have confidence in the data it's using, right? Where you always hear these stories of, hey, we have a financial reporting system, but look over here where we have dozens of spreadsheets where we actually do all the work. Like, that's a concern, right? There's something going on there that we need to figure out, because why do you have these expensive systems if you're still managing stuff in Excel spreadsheets? Red flag in my mind, right? So that's the second thing. The third thing, I think, is getting back to engaging leaders across the organization on data governance and ensuring that the right types of policies are in place, right? And that then helps to develop culture, right? So where can you help to support the development of a culture that supports high quality data across the organization. And all of those three things really are dependent on what I mentioned earlier in terms of your question on audit leaders kind of getting that seat at the table, right? It goes back to relationships, knowledge, and strategy. Do you have the right relationships with people? Do you have the right knowledge? Do you have a strategy to execute it? And then those are some of the things that I would do to get started.
This episode is sponsored by Wolters Kluwer TeamMate, the partner you need to excel in the new world of audit, helping professionals in all industries around the world manage audit and compliance risks.
One thing we haven't really talked about is that next tier up in the discussion on quality and understanding quality. Where does it fit into the discussions between the CAE and the board, or the audit committee?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, if you're starting to incorporate data quality into your risk assessment, you should naturally be starting to have those conversations, right? Because the board is reliant upon data and information being presented to them for decision making, right? In order to execute their oversight responsibilities and help to make good decisions, they need good quality data. So it's certainly something that they should be concerned with, right? So having that conversation, I don't think should be difficult, right, for auditors to bring up that topic, because as a board member, I'm concerned if I'm getting good quality information and all of the, these inches of binders potentially that I'm being handed, is that good information? So I think it should come up naturally in conversations about risk, and then it will ultimately come up in findings and audit reports, right? So you never want a board member to be caught off guard by the types of findings you're bringing them. So hopefully you're having those conversations in advance before you start bringing them significant number of findings in that area. So yeah, I think those conversations should really happen naturally with the board.
And it's easy to get the value add discussion in terms of what internal audit does for the organization.
Yeah, right. Always be prepared to make your case. This is why I'm doing this, right? Because fundamentally, you're making decisions off of this data. I want to make sure, as the auditor reporting to you, board, as the objective auditor and independent auditor reporting to you, I want to make sure that the data you have is the right data for making good decisions. That's value that I can bring to you, right? As a board member, that's a significant area of value add that internal audit can have.
So obviously we've covered a lot of ground, but I did want to give you an opportunity to elaborate further on something we may have touched on, or maybe share any closing thoughts on things we may not have touched on.
Yeah. So I will go to something we didn't touch on at this point, but that's really the current focus on ESG reporting and disclosures, right? And I think there's an important link here when it comes to data quality. So the people, processes, and technologies that are associated with the underlying factors within ESG have likely not been subject to the same level of formality and discipline that we've seen with accounting and financial reporting, right? Like these processes, they've been around for years. People have been doing it for a long time. I mean, ESG has been around for a long time too. Let's not forget that, but not having the level of focus that it has now. But those underlying processes, the things that people are doing every day to support those activities, like I said, have not necessarily been subject to that level of discipline or formality, right? So it's a new ball game. So getting to the data and making sure that we have high quality data to support ESG reporting, I think it's going to be a huge challenge for many organizations. So, that's one thing, knowing that ESG reporting is coming. And I know things are still up in the air here with the SEC requirements and legal challenges and those types of things. But ultimately it's coming. Or if your organization works outside of the United States, you're going to be impacted by other regulations around the world, particularly the EU regulations. So, getting your arms wrapped around that is really key, because I think the data and processes associated with ESG in some instances are going to be very challenging to get to. And, ultimately, I think it's a much more complex version of what we did with SOX, or internal control over financial reporting, 20 years ago, right? I think there's a real opportunity for internal audit to play an important role with understanding the risks associated with this and helping their organizations to embrace the path forward. And data is going to be key to that.
That's a really great observation. I mean, it's not like regulations are going to retrench. They're going to grow, and they're going to continue to grow. Do you see maybe a parallel developing between, are we going to have the equivalent of a SOX era in sustainability reporting and in the future, or maybe even the near future?
Yeah, I do. I think it'll be different in terms of how it evolves, right? Obviously, when Sarbanes-Oxley hit, it was do this now, or fear going to jail. Not to over dramatize it, right? But there was that element to it at the time, right? And so organizations were in panic mode. And I can recall, the organization I was at when we were developing SOX. I mean, our list of controls was 2 to 3 inches thick. Like when you printed out that report, it was unbelievable. We went way too far, right? We used up a lot of time and resources that were unnecessary. But that's because it was unclear, and we were worried, right? The risk was high. So as an organization, I think organizations sort of overreacted to that, right? And I'm not saying that in a bad way. I'm saying it was just a natural outcome of the situation at the time. With ESG, we have more time. We can see it coming, right? The train is moving more slowly down the track. It's still moving, and it's still a difficult train to stop, right? But it's moving a little bit more slowly down the track. So we have a little bit more time. And, unless you're in the EU, right? Because the CSRD has already passed and it's already, coming into effect. So, you got to be moving there already, hopefully. But here in the U.S., we've got maybe a little bit of a slower response time, but it's happening, and it's going to happen. And even without the regulation, the expectations from other stakeholders, investors, and customers, and even employees is still putting that pressure on companies to move forward with this stuff. So I don't think it's going away, and I think it's internal audit's responsibility to be on top of it.
Certainly, this dynamic is going to keep internal auditors busy for many years to come. Again, I can't thank you enough, Jim.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe and rate us. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also catch each episode on YouTube or at the IIA.org. That's THEIIA.org.